Welcome back, everyone, to part two of this course that started, wow, it's hard to remember, back in January. And we ended up at the end of March and took a break so that the Henry George School could bring you some other programming. And I want to kind of take you back a little bit, just so put this course in perspective. This is the basic course that the Henry George School has offered for as long as I've been associated with the school, and going back to really 1932. Of course, it's my version of the course. When I first attended the Henry George School as a student back in 1980, in the classroom, there was no Zoom at that time, as you, I'm sure, know. The way the course was structured is we were reading Henry George's book, Progress and Poverty. Every week we had reading assignments, and we were given questions to write answers to, and then we would come into class and discuss what we came to as the answers to our questions based on our readings, and that would stimulate some interesting discussion often. So one thing very different is, of course, we're in a lecture discussion mode. So I basically know that you're not reading anything. I'm not asking you to read anything. So I'm trying to provide you with material to read. But I would hope that if you've never read Henry George's book, Progress and Poverty, that this course might stimulate you to get a copy of the book and read it. It's certainly worth reading cover to cover, and there's a great deal more in the book than I'm able to cover in this course. So what did we learn, from January to March? Very quickly, Henry George was trying to come up with an analysis of how the world works that was based on observation and logic and reason, and the evidence that he was able to accumulate as he did his own research. And he built his analysis on the basis of what the political economists before him and his contemporaries produced. And in those days, the political economists looked at the world as an interaction of three factors of production that we've talked about. There was land, there was labor, and there was capital. And by capital, Henry George meant capital goods, tangible goods that we produce by our labor, assisted with tools, machinery, etc., other capital goods applied to nature. And the output from that effort was often wealth. Not always wealth, but most often wealth. That is, goods that were produced that had some value to others, some exchange value in markets. And from there, he, built his analysis of, what were the dynamics involved? And the political economists had given him a good deal to work with. They came up with terms that described the wealth, that portion of the wealth that was attributed to nature, and they called that rent, and to labor, and they called that wages, and to capital goods, they used the term interest. Probably the most confusion in this modern world is this term interest. And there's been, any number of discussions about that concept here at the Henry George School and by many other people. So George has his own definition of what interest is, and it is that portion of the wealth that's produced that is attributed to the use of capital goods. So that's very different from the use of the term interest with regard to what you would pay, for example, as a fee for the use of someone else's money. If you borrow from a bank, you pay interest on the loan, and that is basically a fee that you pay for the combination of risk. You're rewarding the lender for the risk of making you a loan and for the time value of the money that could be used otherwise, but was given to you for the use temporarily until you repaid it. So those are some of the complexities. at the beginning of the 20th century, political economy was giving ground to the new study, the new discipline of economics. And this is where we left off in the course at the end of March. And so this lecture deals with that change. And I title it Neoclassical Economic Theory and Holes in the Price Mechanism. So we're going to talk a little bit about what the price mechanism is and how it operates and what its importance is. As always with these courses, they're interactive. So you should feel free to interrupt me if you need clarification from me, if you have a question, you have a comment. Okay, so let me start off. Already during Henry George's lifetime, the political economy that he worked to refine was under attack by European trained economists such as this fellow here, Richard Ely. And Ely and others sought to influence the powers that be. They sought status within government and within corporate circles. And so their work focused on the type of analysis that would bring them recognition and cause those in government and corporate circles to come to them for input. So they try to explain how the world works from a standpoint of what would be valuable to those entities, corporate and government. Basically, what does government need? What does corporate interest need in terms of information and analysis? The focus of the economists' research and writing was therefore far different from that of their predecessors and contemporary political economists. An important theoretical question economists wanted to explore was whether or not price clears all markets. And this is the main issue with economists at this stage, and even today, is that do changes in price clear markets? And what do they mean by that? Well, this graphical representation explains that. If you've ever taken an economics course in college or even high school, you're going to see this graph repeatedly. It's an illustration of how price theoretically clears markets. This conveys the assertion that those who supply a good or a service and those who demand a good or a service will agree on a price for a given quantity. So when the supply and demand curves that are shown here intersect, this is called the equilibrium state. And you can think about it in just normal terms. It makes sense that, as prices go up, the supply will tend to go up because people are saying, okay, there's a higher price that I'm going to get for my good or service. I'll supply more. On the other hand, as prices go up, the demand for those goods and services is likely to come down. But there's some point in the middle where they reach a state of equilibrium. Many of the European trained economists, in order to make this work, they embraced a simplified, what's called neoclassical theory of markets, asserting that price serves as a market clearing function for all factors of production, that is, for land, labor, and capital, and that markets always return to a state of general equilibrium, a state where price is high enough to satisfy those who bring supply to the market and low enough to satisfy those willing to pay for any good or service. The question is, for us and for critics of neoclassical economics, is this right? Does it work in the real world? Is that the way the real world works? Well, that's what we're going to try to examine now. Neoclassical theory applies in a general way to labor market dynamics because labor in the aggregate and as a factor of production is quite sensitive to changes in the price offered in return for labor. We can see that, just in the modern world, where people are enticed to leave the work that they're doing when there's an opportunity for higher wages doing something else. Moreover, what's important for us to understand, and I think with most of us this is true, most of us must continue to offer our services in exchange for compensation, even as the wages we're offered are being forced down by market conditions. We may not have sufficient savings or an investment portfolio that yields enough income for us to live on without working. Of course, there's a lower limit to what individuals are able to accept as monetary wages, and that is what enables bare subsistence. If you're offered wages for your labor that will not allow you to continue to feed yourself in a very basic way, clothe yourself, house yourself in a very basic way, then what's the incentive to take that employment? And so we tend to see people fall out of the labor force when those circumstances affect them. Survival really requires that the majority of us continue to produce wealth or provide services without pause. As I said, if you look at the statistics, for example, 1 out of 4 people in the United States, age 65 and over, live on Social Security benefits alone. They have no savings and no investments. So without that Social Security benefit coming from the government, they would certainly be forced to live on charity, either a family or of their community. So, for labor, the price mechanism works pretty well. The same, I think, is true for markets for capital goods. They're also sensitive to the price mechanism. Equipment, buildings, etc., all depreciate over time, and so they lose functional utility, which is their ability to produce the goods that they were designed to produce, and they also, with depreciation, lose exchange value. So here again, as the price for capital goods goes up, producers of those goods tend to bring more to the market. They increase the supply, and at some point, the buyers and sellers of capital goods find this equilibrium point where they're pretty much satisfied with the price they're paying and the price they're getting. Think about depreciation then. A continuous requirement for capital goods is that they have an ongoing infusion of labor and of new capital goods in order to maintain both their use value and their exchange value. All capital goods are depreciating assets. And I'm sure you can think of some capital goods that lose exchange value over a shorter period of time than their actual usable time. Cell phones seem to be one of the best examples I can think of in our modern environment. People are constantly upgrading to the next new cell phone technology, even though their old phone still works reasonably well, but the new one has more apps and other characteristics. And there's the automobile is a perfect example of how a capital good is a depreciating asset. Even though you might acquire an automobile for personal use rather than for business, even if you acquire it for business, by the time you drive it off the lot from the dealer and drive it around the street a few times, it has lost some of its exchange value. You decide this isn't really the vehicle for me, and you drive back to the dealer later that day, and you say, I'd like to get my money back. And the dealer says, well, this is a used vehicle now. So you paid $55,000 this morning, but I'm only prepared to give you $52,000 back of your money. You wouldn't be too happy about it, but it's a recognition now that that's not the same item that you purchased in the morning. Now, what about credit markets? This is probably the most controversial so far in this discussion. The demand for and the supply of credit is also, in my opinion, relatively sensitive to the price mechanism. Central banks rely on this by lowering interest rate charges in order to stimulate borrowing, or raise interest rate charges to make borrowing more expensive, and thereby try to bring a halt to a general increase in the price of goods and services. This is the central bank's tool for trying to deal with inflation. Expand the amount of credit by lowering interest rates, enticing people to borrow more. And when prices are increasing faster than the incomes of people are increasing, et cetera, and there's inflation, raise interest rates to contract the demand for credit and for borrowing, and hopefully that keeps inflation down. And we see that, in every country with a central bank, and how they try to keep the economy in some level of stability, at least control inflation. Does it work all the time? No, it certainly doesn't. And there's a lot of debate about why it doesn't work. And we've had at the Henry George School a growing number of discussions about the role of the central bank and the money system, and what reforms, if any, are needed to sort of solve that problem. Okay, so where does this take us? Well, first, think about deregulation of the U.S. financial markets and of other national markets that began in the 1970s, which expanded access to credit and competition among credit providers, at least initially. There was a lot of deregulation going on in the financial services sector, and that was thought to be a good thing. Credit is normally competitively priced for risk, at least when the actual risk is analyzed and disclosed to lenders and investors, or when other generally political considerations are not involved. So in my life as a mortgage lending officer for a commercial bank years ago, this is what we did. We looked at a person who came in the door to borrow funds from the bank in order to acquire a residential property, and we looked at their income, we looked at their credit history, and we used certain criteria to forecast whether or not it was a good risk to lend them the money. Would they repay it, based on all those factors? And statistics said that we were right most of the time, except when there was some sort of shock to the system. If there is a serious recession that turns into a depression, then all bets are off. Many people are going to lose employment, lose income. The causes in normal times, put quotes around normal, for people not paying their debt are usually one of three things: illness, divorce, or unemployment. So any institution that provides loans to people is taking on a certain degree of risk, and the market allows for the pricing of that risk. Well, an unforeseen consequence of financial deregulation has been a dramatic consolidation of the banking sector. And this has resulted in an expanded dependency on the continued operation of a small number of huge entities that are perceived as, quote, too big to fail. When I when I started to work at Fannie Mae in late 1984, about 80% of the volume of business that Fannie Mae did. And for those of you who don't know what Fannie Mae is, it's a government-sponsored enterprise, shareholder owned, that invested in mortgage loans. That's basically what we did. You could think of Fannie Mae as a large savings institution with a lot more complexity. But when I started there, we did about 80% of our volume with almost 300 types of loan originators and lending institutions, commercial banks, savings and loans, mortgage bankers, and a few other kinds of institutions thrown in. When I retired in 2005, 80% of our business volume came from about 8 companies. And that gives you a sense of, in that period of time, what financial deregulation did in terms of consolidation of the business volume. And there were a lot of political discussions about it. One of the arguments in favor of the big institutions was, well, the United States is losing ground to some of the huge financial institutions overseas, and in Britain or in Japan. And today that would be increasingly thought of as China. And so we had to become as big as they were in order to be as competitive as they were in gaining the business in the global marketplace. 2008 is an indication of how well that worked out for us. The credit markets are also plagued, unfortunately, by a lot of fraud and predatory lending practices. And that's been a serious challenge to the whole process, the whole process of people finding financing when they need it at an affordable rate of interest and under terms that are reasonable. But you know the stories of people who have terrible credit, but they need credit. Where do they go? They go to loan sharks or the high cost credit providers, and somehow they have to try to be able to repay those loans. And if they go to the unscrutable loan sharks, they might end up in serious problems if they're not able to repay the loan, even though the rate of interest might be, double or triple what the commercial bank was charging at the time. Any questions so far? Any comments other than what Mike had about the senior citizen status in the U.S.? So where does that take us with regard to this whole idea of price clearing markets? Well, okay, it works for labor, it works for capital goods, and it works reasonably well for credit. Where it doesn't work is for the markets for land. And the neoclassical theory fails miserably here, because trying to apply the price mechanism to markets for land, and remember, land is broadly defined to include not just rural, urban, and resource-laden, surface land, the resources below the land, but all natural assets that have an inelastic supply. When you look at this graph, that vertical line means that those assets of nature have an inelastic supply. No matter what the price is, you can't make any more. Nature is what it is. It's finite in that sense. So that's what this graph is designed to convey a bit here. Land doesn't normally depreciate. It can be made less useful by misuse or by natural disasters. I'll give you actually, last evening, I attended the screening of a new documentary film that I hope when it comes out, you might want to try and see. The title of the film is Common Ground. And it's a story of how our agricultural techniques around the world have degraded the land and its fertility and its ability to produce agricultural commodities. And this whole film was an argument for regenerative agricultural techniques. And it was really powerful to see how successful these techniques have been when applied. And in that sense, the utility of the land where it had been degraded was returned. And it was returned mostly by understanding how nature operates to create fertility in land, to how it can produce nutrients and enable plants to grow. And there were a number of aspects, I won't go into detail, but of regenerative agriculture that were not intuitive, at least not to me, but were in the film were made fairly persuasive. So land is very different. And so because economists were dealing with a factor of production that had an inelastic supply, it made it very difficult for them to consider land distinct in their analyses. This is arguably the reason why the first generation of economists were compelled to remove land as a distinct factor of production. What economists really could not explain away is that the supply of land is in fact perfectly inelastic. And that means the supply is inherently insensitive to changes in price. So they had to make an argument that land was in fact subject to the same characteristics as capital goods. And so they began to write land out of the equation and just say, well, land is another form of capital. And they use that as an argument for a two-factor system in their analysis. And as it turns out, the mathematics for creating equations that can be solved is much easier without having to consider this third factor as a unique factor of production. Were there political considerations in it? Well, that's certainly what in recent years, the book by Fred Harrison and Mason Gaffney and Chris Fader argued that at The Corruption of Economics, that there were other considerations other than, method of analysis that came into play. So let me go back here. Rising land prices arguably provide a great signal for landowners to hold land idle in anticipation of even higher price gains. This is speculation. So even when property markets collapse, deep pocket investors see enormous opportunity for acquiring properties at foreclosure from owners who've run into cash flow problems. And with the increasing concentration of income and wealth in the world, every time there's an economic downturn or crisis, this actually rewards those who have the deepest pockets and can engage in this long-term speculation. It's really not an impact on their living standards, on their ability to own property. And so we get a constantly increasing concentration of the ownership of land and natural resources around the world. And that's a serious social problem as well as an economic problem that Henry George identified. One of the early proponents of the new economics was this economist Frank Knight. And he attempted to justify the merger of land with capital goods for purposes of his analysis. And in 1956, here's what he wrote. He said, land is capital merely. Defined in any realistic way, it presents an infinite variety of conditions as to maintenance and replacement requirements and possibilities of increase in supply, as does any other general class of capital instruments. So Frank Knight is basically saying, land doesn't really have an inelastic supply. You can see that there are substitutes all over. That constantly people make decisions, and there's always land available for that's more reasonably priced, et cetera, than what is offered on the market immediately. You just be patient, look around. So it's his way of saying we can produce more land, but he's not really explaining that what we're doing is not producing more land necessarily, but we're converting land that has one set of characteristics into land that has another set of characteristics by the infusion of capital goods, giving it just a couple things to think about. Like, for example, when we construct dams, all right, we take some land that might have been used for agriculture or even a town, and we take that land out of use because we build a dam upriver from it, or I guess downriver is what I mean. And those assets, those constructed assets are gone. But the land below the dam is protected from floods, and so there's increased production down below the dam based on the fact that that land is now much more safely utilized. There's much less risk of a flood, et cetera, et cetera. And so, as a society, there's a trade-off, and we make a judgment that building that dam is worth the cost of taking some land out of use in return for making much more land much more usable. But what is achieved that change is a lot of labor and a lot of capital goods. In fairness to Knight and to other economists, I do agree that there is a fair amount of substitution, like with the dam. And this makes it seem that the supply of land is actually elastic, and therefore responses to changes in the market price being offered. Henry George would agree, I think, with that the argument would be stronger if the land and natural resources of the United States and any other country was more widely owned and less of it held idle when there is much higher potential productive use. And I'm going to show you some charts in a slide or two that conveys what I mean by that. So getting back to the economics of land markets and the problem with the neoclassical assertion that price clears land markets in the same way that price clears the markets for labor, capital goods, and credit, what follows are some graphs that I put together that show why land markets are so different. So in this first graph, again, we see the vertical supply curve. And in this graph, the total supply of land in a region, without regard to topographic or other natural characteristics or the degree of societal organization, is labeled S1. So that's the total amount of land in this region. You could treat this as an entire country. You could treat it even as the global supply of land. But regional analysis tends to make this much clearer. So now we're going to take a look at the land that is not totally there, but what is actually available to be brought into production. So in this second graph, the 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 um, the idea is to identify that portion of the total land that, at least with current technologies available, that can be productively utilized or cannot be productively utilized because of topography. It might be subject to frequent flooding, the potential for earthquakes, etc. So the quantity lost to the total supply is reflected by the distance between the supply curves S1 and S2. So we're moving to the left, bringing down the supply of land that is available for production. Does that make sense so far? Anyone have any questions? What I'm getting at? Okay. Now we take into consideration the lands that a community allocates for parks, for recreation, for animal preserves, wetlands, etc. So in our hypothetical example, the amount of land removed from developable supply is the difference between S1 and S3. So we're now reducing, for these reasons, the amount of land that would be available for development in this region. The next step, we're going to look at locations that are being used by the community for governmental buildings and other public purposes, airports, highways, railway lines, and other public agency uses. So adding this amount of land to the total removed brings us to this difference between S1 and S4. Thus, we're at a point where only half of the total supply of land is available for private development. That is, for purchase and sale or lease under market conditions. And now you're faced with a strange looking supply curve, a leftward leaning supply curve. What do you think that means? Anyone want to take a shot? All right. In the absence of any thoughts, what it's telling you that this strange looking supply curve leaning to the left is an indication that even as the price for locations is rising, the quantity of land potentially available for development is falling. And the reason is that the expectation of even higher prices is an incentive for owners of land to withdraw their land holdings from the market. So prices going up on the vertical axis, the supply of land available for development, even though it can be developed, is leaning to the left because there's less of it being offered to the market. And the net effect of that, of course, is to jack up the prices because there's demand for this land. It's developable. There's demand for it. People need it. Businesses need it. But owners of land have all the incentive under current conditions to hold that land off the market. And so the supply curve tends to lean to the left. Economists and economics don't have a place for this. A leftward leaning supply curve is not something that they can graph on a normal supply demand graph. It's just an abnormality that they really cannot factor into their analysis. So back to Frank Knight. On the general subject of speculation, Knight expresses a widely taught view of economics professors. He writes, all markets are speculative and, in fact, approach the character of an ideal market more or less in proportion to the degree that they are explicitly and effectively speculative. That is, to the degree in which there is organized speculation. Knight and most economists look at speculation as a positive, that owners of land are holding their land off the market until the market is really right for it, so that, in their view, it does not come on the market and have a interim use that is really an underuse of the land. And so for them, it's creating a sort of a reserve of supply that will be eventually opened when the price is right. But think about it. There are some individuals and some entities that have no need for additional revenue. They have no need for additional cash flow. They simply are going to acquire land and hold it forever for whatever reason. You have investors in all around the world who own thousands or hundreds of thousands of acres of land. There's about 100 investors in the United States, owners of land in the United States, each of which owns land the size of the state of Delaware or even larger, with no incentive to do any more development in that land than already exists. And so that takes out the supply of land that's available for development by others to a significant level. So that supply curve for land in those regions tilts way to the left. Does that make sense to you? Well, there's another part of this that's worth talking about. And a longtime teacher of the Henry George School out in California, who passed away during COVID-19, a good friend of some of us, came up with the idea that land is a collectible, somewhat similar in characteristics to other collectibles like artwork, classic automobiles, or antiques. And that was Harry Pollard. And I have written and produced a video on Harry and his teaching and his life that's available on my YouTube channel. And I would invite you to take a look at it because he had some really innovative ideas on how to teach the subject of political economy. And he did so for many years with high school teachers. You know, how do you teach this subject to high school students? And Harry spent a lot of time and energy trying to develop materials that would be appropriate for high schools. Speculation in the financial markets and financial instruments is another area where the consequences of risk-taking are sometimes imposed on the general population, as we know. This whole too big to fail issue has come back to haunt us. It came back to haunt us in many countries and in the United States after 2008. And in response, the US government, in conjunction with the Federal Reserve, took all sorts of steps to try to re-stimulate the economy, to bring insolvent, banks back to solvency, and to enable companies that had lost a great deal during the crisis into allowing them to continue operation and become profitable again. After my retirement from Fannie Mae, and then in 2008, when Fannie Mae's asset values on its books fell below a certain level, the government moved in and took it over. And here we are in 2024, and Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, its sister organization, are still both under government control. There's a lot of discussion about to what extent that was necessary and to what extent it's necessary now to keep those two entities within the framework of government management. So In this age of global interconnected financial markets, the portion of available financial reserves allocated to market speculation is huge. In this way, financial speculation draws funds away from the investment in capital goods and real economic growth. And so that's the lesson of our land markets. Speculation in the land market simply takes investment reserves that could be otherwise utilized to produce real goods and provide real services and put it into decisions for hoarding land and natural resources and keeping them off the market in anticipation that rising population and rising demand will enrich those investors even more. And the problem that Henry George identified is that our system of laws and our system of taxation rewards and encourages this kind of behavior. And so his efforts were to try to find a solution to that problem. How do we free the land markets up? How do we make the land markets operate more competitively so that land is brought to its highest best use as the market demands and needs it, and at a price that users can potentially afford? So that's this lesson.